seismic shift in terms of COVID and what that's caused. Air quality is still very much high on the agenda and leading to some pretty interesting policy development and innovation. And of course, climate change is now being recognised as a much bigger issue and happening much sooner than people thought not that long ago. So this webinar has been put on not to explain what these things are, hopefully you all kind of know what they are, but to provide an insight and opinion as to how things have changed in recent years and to look forward in terms of what may be on the horizon in terms of policy, innovation, risks. And as the name suggests, we certainly feel that there is something in the air, whether that's the wind of real change, the sweet smell of victory against the odds, or just a load of hot air. By way of introduction, my name is Howard Waples. I'm a director at Temple. I have a background in environmental impact assessment, SCA, health impact assessment, equalities, climate change, and general all-round sustainability. I'll be covering quite a broad set of topics today, covering the changes to the various legislation and strategies that is coming out, touching on a bit of the corporate ESG elements, green investment, technical innovation, and the real critical thing of public action. I'll introduce my colleagues.
Hi there, I'm Matthew Barnes. I'm Principal Air Quality Consultant with Temple. My background is pretty much just pure air quality. And today I'll be talking about trends in air quality, the new WHO guidelines, air quality neutral, air quality positive statements, and how green infrastructure can help improving air quality. And I'll pass you over to my colleague, Shan.
Thank you, Matt. My name is Shang Shen. I'm a director at Temple. I look after our air quality and climate change team. Having worked in this sector for over 25 years, I actually really see a change are happening and happening really fast. So today I'm going to cover a little bit on COP26, as well as the latest UK's carbon budget. I will touch on whole life carbon assessment, circular economy statement, corporate GHG reporting, as well as looking at a linkage between air quality and climate change.
Excellent, thank you both. And at the end, we'll be doing a brief-ish question answers from the three of us. If I could ask you to leave any questions until then, and then we can go around any kind of hands raised, or if of course you'd like to raise any in the chat function, then please do. So as the name of this webinar suggests, we definitely feel that change is upon us. And it's easy to get bogged down sometimes in the feeling that it's all a little bit too little, too late. But I've put this slide together to show what I see as the four main categories of driver towards better air quality, climate mitigation, resilience, and overall sustainability. They each influence each other and influenced by the others to some extent. And so you can't really take them in isolation. In fact, they feed off each other. And so in the continuation of the theme of this webinar, I've kind of likened it to a tornado of change. So government and other stakeholders are setting the legislation, driving stronger policy, devising all sorts of strategies, technical innovation and disruptors, without which any of this would be possible, challenge the status quo, drive new solutions and ways of thinking. Companies and global finance plays a pretty big and ever-increasing part in this, and they're beginning to recognise that the cost of not doing anything will be far greater in the longer run, perhaps even the shorter run, than the cost of actually making changes to the way money is invested or the way they operate. And of course, the real change here is you and me. The environment is now top of the public agenda thanks to certain activists, journalists, social media empowerment. So I'll start off with this slide, which is arguably probably the most important in a way. So environmental activism isn't new. Who remembers Swampy in the mid-1990s? He was well known at that time for interrupting major road schemes, and his group would chain themselves to trees and that sort of thing. However, what I think is striking is the level of ridicule from the press at the time, and the perception that they were just being damn awkward and holding back progress. Fast forward 20 years, and Swampy, I believe, is still going strong, thank heavens. But there's been a notable change in terms of the Greta effect, if you like, feeding off the eco-anxiety, which is a term that I hadn't come across until a couple of years ago. Activism is, like it or loathe it, is actually leading to some very real results. I mean, Extinction Rebellion in Chile, Britain, are up to their old tricks, but arguably, causing a lot of disruption. But that's sometimes the only way you actually get noticed. Local authorities declared a climate emergency back in 2019, 2020, without necessarily knowing what it meant or how to get there. But what became pretty clear pretty soon is that without actually empowering the people, the citizens within the particular local authority area, you're not going to get the buy-in, you're not going to get the new ideas. And so, citizens' assemblies have sprung up as well. And and finally on that list, I've mentioned about behaviour change. I mean, level of meat eating is declining fairly rapidly, and plant-based products are starting to appear. People, you could say, are not flying as much, but that's likely to be a cause of COVID, especially in the last couple of years. And business sees it as a way of capturing new customers, showing their credentials, and so you've got things like eco-labeling that's appearing all the more. I mean, this slide, given the short amount of time I've got today, it's probably a bit optimistic to cover everything on this slide in any great detail. So if I say that, the Climate Change Act was introduced in 2008, that was quite fundamental to the way things had changed in the subsequent 10 years or so. And then following Paris Agreement, the government urgently changed that legislation to set the net zero target by 2050. And that's led to a really large change as well. It's effectively turbocharged a whole raft of new strategies. So, I mean, it seems like in a way a new one is produced each month. So I've set out a few key ones here. So clearly no one was talking about hydrogen 10 years ago, but now it seems to be everywhere. Decarbonising transport is seen as one of the largest contributors to our overall emissions and a challenge. And although Road to Zero focused on more like highways, the decarbonising transport strategy earlier this summer is quite a big shift. The clean air strategy is something that brings in opportunities for the new legislation to create a stronger and more coherent framework for action to tackle air pollution. And it will be underpinned by new England-wide powers for enforcement and the creation of clean air zones. I'll touch on the green finance strategy a little bit later on. But just this week, I believe it was, the government has actually produced a holistic net zero strategy called Build Back Greener. They always like their taglines, and that's a world first, if you like. Going back a few years, the 25-year environment plan was produced, and that's quite a formative bit of document, really, that actually sees the environment in a medium to long term, which is so critical in terms of being able to develop and understand natural capital and to devise a set of thresholds and targets and that sort of thing, criteria in which to measure an overall environmental net gain, which is what we're seeking to do, to leave the environment in a better state than what we found it. The London plan, Sean will be looking at that a little bit later on in terms of the strength of new policy that's come through regarding whole life carbon, circular economy. And of course, Brexit is that word that we haven't heard quite as much of lately, but it's very, I think, important for the UK to be flying the flag, to be showing leadership on a kind of international scale. The third of the four pillars of the tornado is the technological disruption, and I mean there's so much happening. I mean without technology, none of this would happen. But of course, you could argue without technology, none of this would have happened in the first place. So obviously, renewable energy. The UK is a world leader in offshore wind production, and that looks set to stay. Solar farms are appearing more and more to try and bolster the UK's power mix. But it's not just about producing more energy. Smart cities, smart grids, demand side management is also a very critical area whereby you try and make your energy network more flexible by storage and releasing it during times of less peak, and that can help by just not requiring so much energy being produced in the first place. Energy efficiency, again, is not necessarily anything new. I remember sort of the cavity wall insulations and loft insulation, but there's a huge push now to do deep building retrofit, and we can come on to that a little bit later as well. And finally, heat pumps. Two small words, but with a very big future to play, I believe, in helping us decarbonize as a nation. The cutting off of new gas connections from new residential dwellings will be happening, and there is money being made available to funds to householders to install heat pumps instead of new boilers. So, I mean, the green investment side of things, green finance strategy I was mentioning earlier, the effects are beginning to be felt across all scales and types of business. So, as part of the Paris Agreement, each country agreed to set its own emissions reductions targets called nationally determined contributions, which will be reviewed every 5 years. And rich countries are needing to help the poorer countries by providing climate finance to adapt to climate change and switch to renewable energy. And there was a target of $100 billion per year to be invested into that by 2020, which we've not quite reached, but as you can see from the graph in the top right, the number of bonds and funds has actually increased quite dramatically over the last couple of years, and are forecast to continue to do so. The Financial Stability Board created the Task Force on Climate climate-related financial disclosures, TCFD, to improve resilience and increase reporting of climate-related financial information. So this results in kind of more effective evaluation of any risks associated with large companies and their suppliers, competitors, and enables better informed decisions about where to allocate capital, and to just better understand the risks to their activities over all sorts of different timeframes. And yeah, the government, lots of good things to say, I think, about what the government is doing. Quite a few bad things as well, but yeah, the government's the first G20 country to make these disclosures mandatory for particular companies as well. Carbon trading is essentially buying and selling the credits that allow a company or other entity to emit a certain amount of CO2. And this could be part of an international trade agreement aimed at gradually reducing emissions. However, it's not just an international level. I think if you look at the net zero policy requirements of major developments in London, for instance, you can see that there's actually now a price per tonne, which I think currently is £95 per tonne over 30 years. And local authorities can then collect that money and use it for offsetting. And by offsetting, I mean, yes, the sort of tree planting, but also the retrofitting of their own kind of housing stock, public buildings and that sort of thing. So yeah, looking back finally to the importance of people power again, the ever increasing number of businesses are signing up to sustainability schemes such as the Pledge to Net Zero and how to become a B Corp. And I'm proud to say that Temple is one of those companies. These schemes seek to certify that an organisation is applying good environmental social governance and allows them to show them off as responsible and ethical to satisfy a range of stakeholders. And of course, one of the most important stakeholders is the people that work in them. So I hope that's given you a bit of perspective as to what's in the air for a kind of a macro scale across a number of different levels. But I'll now hand you over to Matt for a bit of a focus on the air quality perspective.
Thank you very much, Howard. I'm aiming to begin with the negatives and try and move towards the positives with air quality. Back in 1952, London experienced one of the worst smog episodes ever seen anywhere in the world, where an estimated 10,000 people died due to complications from the poor air quality. Now, air quality within London and the UK has improved since then, but tragically in 2013, Ella Kissy Deborah died when she was only 9 years old. She lived 30 metres from the notoriously busy South Circular Road in London, and this was the first time that a death was solely attributed to poor air quality. Whereas air quality contributes to thousands of deaths each year, this was the first time that it was put onto the death certificate as the sole reason. But hopefully, we can move forward from there. So current air quality guidelines in the UK, 40 micrograms for nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter, and 25 target for the smaller particulate matter. But in Scotland, they've introduced much tougher objectives for both sizes of particulate matter. And that's not to say that Scotland has good air quality across the whole of the country. Glasgow, Edinburgh, Perth, Dundee, Aberdeen all have quite large air quality management areas. But if we look at the most recent WHO guidelines, they're not too far, they're not that much tougher than what Scotland has got for particulate matter. For NO2, though, that's a long way to go for both England, Scotland, to try and reduce NO2 emissions, NO2 concentrations down to that level will be quite tough in the long term. But that's no reason why we shouldn't aim to do that. And then we can look at what the current air quality has been in the last couple of years in London. If we look at the North Circular, another very notoriously busy road in London with the Hanger Lane Junction, you can see that pre-COVID, 2019, the Hanger Lane automatic monitor recorded 64 against an objective of 40, which is about as bad as you can get nowadays. But during COVID, due to various lockdowns, it has dropped down to 51. I remember talking to colleagues 18 months ago when we had our first lockdown, thinking, well, we'll be back in the office in 3 or 4 weeks' time, not realizing 18 months later, I'm still only going into the office twice a week, and as many other people are, which has reduced significantly the volume of traffic on our roads. And a byproduct of that is that air quality has improved. Now, other methods for improving air quality. In London, in April 2014, air quality neutral assessments were introduced. Now, I wouldn't recommend that if you've got electric vehicle charging that you're powering your vehicle using a diesel generator. But with air quality neutral assessments, the development proposal should at least be neutral and not lead to any further deterioration of existing poor air quality. It was brought in because in London, there is a large number of very small sources of pollutants, and it looks at both the building and transport emission benchmarks. It's also quantitative, so you have fairly good understanding of what a development will be and how much you've got to improve it to become neutral. The next stage from an air quality neutral assessment is air quality positives, where making an active contribution to improving air quality in and around a development to minimise exposure to existing sources of poor air quality. It's the air quality positive statement is part of the new London plan, and it's a qualitative, holistic approach from the inception all the way through to completion of a development. Continuous process where constraints and opportunities are outlined, methods introduced to make it easier for people to not pollute. There'll be more cycling infrastructure, better public transport links, and linking each development with other developments to create a network of possibilities almost, with the long-term aim that there will be far less pollution. And one of the methods that can be used to help improving air quality is through nature-based solutions. Now, green walls have been around for a while, and I'm sure most cities now you'll see them. This particular example is near King's Cross, and as the name suggests, it's a vertical built structure intentionally covered by vegetation. And research by the Ignition Project has shown that a green wall can reduce NO2 concentrations within a street canyon at street level by between 18 to 35%, which is a good level to be reduced. And the same with PM10. Of course, for other nature-based solutions, and climate change, I can pass you over to my colleague Sian.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you both for your very insightful thinking. So I will touch on COP26 first. As we know, COP26 is very high on the agenda. It's almost every day on the news. and it will begin on 31st October to 12th November. They selected a most spooky day to start a COP. We probably know COP means Conference of All Parties, is UN's climate change conference. What COP tried to achieve, if we're looking at collectively, reducing emissions, achieving net zero is never alone for one country or two countries. It's the whole world, all need to come together. So the main aim is actually try to achieve an action plan to keep the temperature rise under 1.25 degrees. So surprisingly, I came home one day, discovered my 8-year-old daughter have done homework, which all the kids being asked by the teacher to write to the MP. So I noted what she wrote. She said, to help global warming, I'm going to grow more trees, more plants, walk to school every day, use less paper, and I won't buy something I don't need. I thought, oh dear, spot on. You are going to plant more trees. That's our nature-based solution. You go to work to school every day. You walk to school, obviously, with adult supervision. You're trying to use a green transport. And you use less paper and don't buy anything you don't need. It's a demand side of reduction of emissions. That's all about what all we try to achieve. And also, she said, what would you do to follow the Paris Agreement? I didn't realize she even know Paris Agreement. So that's demonstrate the momentum actually happening publicly, as echoed by what just Harold mentioned. The public momentum is very high. Our local school are doing a very good job to keep our children engaged with current affairs. So that was exactly COP tried to achieve, translate ambition to actions. So if we're looking at UK on an international stage, UK, probably in terms of size and population, is not a large country, shall we say. UK's contribution to the world in terms of emission, probably less than 1%. However, UK probably being seen as a thought leader and one of the first economy have a legal binding 2050 carbon neutral target. That's the first in the world. UK also very good in terms of setting up framework, legislation, develop new methodology, innovation, and thinking. So one of the things related to our daily life, for example, is that the end of sale of petrol and diesel-based fueled cars in the UK by 2030 brought forward by 10 years. That's also one of the world first. But if we're looking at on the international stage, if we're looking at those larger emitters, such as China, one of the notable kind of announcement they made recently was to stop all the overseas coal-fired power station investment that would wipe over $50 billion of investment. That's a significant, probably if they can achieve that, that's a significant emission reduction, the contribution to the whole world. And with US, as we probably all knew, is returned to Paris Agreement as of this year due to the new president. So everyone is looking up to the Glasgow COP26 conference happening in a few days next week, Sunday. How UK set up its target. If we're looking back, 2020, the UK's Climate Change Committee have a progress report already set up priorities and opportunities. It's touched on all the aspects which Howard just mentioned earlier, looking at retrofitting buildings, looking at energy efficiency, looking at infrastructure, looking at transport network. That means actually climate change is not about one thing. It's in fact, it's about everything. everything we do, the way we live, the way we produce, every aspect of life potentially will change, particularly with COVID. Also, I think that the changes are actually irreversible. UK at the end of the last year published the sixth UK carbon budget. And that set up another trajectory. It's a step up from previous carbon budget 3, 4, and 5. So we are currently in the carbon budget 3. So it set up a trend. The overall direction is the standards, the emission targets, getting more stricter, getting more tougher to achieve. How we can achieve that? It will be looking at a transformation on the organization level in terms of carbon emission reduction. It's also looking at on all the development level, either it's property or infrastructure. So if we're looking at organization level in terms of carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, UK from 2019 already looking at requirements on quoted companies to report their greenhouse gas emissions. As of this year, recently, 2021, also published a new conversion factor for greenhouse gas emission reporting. So that's happening at an organization level. But if we're looking at development level later on, we can see that's also have more requirements. In terms of emission reductions, Matt mentioned early on about current state of play in terms of air quality issue in the UK. In fact, what we see in terms of emission reduction and air quality improvement are actually interlinked. We can say this is probably the two sides of the same coin. A recent report published by EQUIC looking at UK's zero carbon pathway, how that could affect air quality. So this graph on the right is taken from that report. So if we're looking at the linkage between air pollution and climate change can impact on air quality. For example, when you have extreme weather conditions, when you such as drought or hot summer or high temperature or increased storm, it can also have impact on air quality. On the other hand, air quality also impact on climate. If you release more black carbon in the atmosphere, that can make the warming effects more significant, as well as aerosol or clouds and tropospheric ozone and so on. If we're looking at emissions core benefit, emission reduction core benefit, most of the case, the emission reduction can result a positive air quality impact, meaning air quality could improve, but not always. I think this has to be looking at in a great detail because the interlinkage is not completely linear. So as the graph on the right demonstrates, this is again taken from the report on net zero pathway impact on air quality. Some of the agriculture land use, if you're planting more biogenic VOC related, that kind of emission planting more, you actually could potentially increase VOC level, maybe not good for air quality. But overall, majority, improving climate change, control the global warming, have a positive impact on air quality, can improve air quality. So we know air quality is part of on the development and infrastructure level. It's part of requirements of environmental statement or environmental impact assessment. So does climate change. Probably even more so in recent years, climate change assessment becomes more important in every EIA submission. So we're looking at a guidance published as recent of last year, looking at climate change resilience adaptation assessment. This is follow on from UK's declaration of the Climate Change Act, the legal binding act, published in 2008 and amended 2019. And also it's a follow on and a step up from the 2017 EIA legislation. So this we're looking at climate change mitigation, which is on the climate, as well as climate resilience. So how we can adapt from the climate impact. So probably worth noting, in EIA guidance, one of the part of that is looking at greenhouse gas emissions as well to feed into overall assessment of resilience and adaptation. So we see a momentum, we see the changes and the requirements are happening and probably become more stringent for the property or infrastructure development. I probably will just use London as an example. The London plan published in March 2021 this year, 1st March. And in particular, one of the emphasis is looking at minimize greenhouse gas emissions, looking at green infrastructure, looking at managing heat risk, looking at reduce waste and supporting the circular economy. So among all the environmental indicators, those few are standing out. Because in the past, for part of the planning submission, carbon assessment was not part of requirement. So this is a step up because minimize greenhouse gas emissions require a holistic approach. As set out in the New London Plan, looking at major development should be net zero and looking at the inclusion of the detailed energy strategy, looking at building zero emissions, looking at carbon offset, as well as a whole life carbon assessment. So part of the planning submission now require from pre-application stage, a whole life carbon assessment consideration. This is feeds through from pre-app stage to the post-application. So in REBA stage 2 and 3 as well, looking at more detailed whole life carbon assessment. Next slide. So this is actually made quite impact because when developer consider planning submission, now they need to consider more, they need to prepare more in terms of how the design could come together. So whole life carbon assessment, looking at embodied carbon, as well as operational carbon, as well as end of life stage of carbon as well. In addition to that, this is actually, next slide, linked to the circular economy as well, because circular economy looking at try to reduce waste, try to make the economy moving away from linear kind of throwaway type of concept to be able to reuse, recycle, and regenerate. So circular economy statement is also featured as part of London Plan, New London Plan as well. So, and also be required as part of the planning submission. So this is just two examples. Actually, probably what translated from an overarching international policy to a national policy legislation requirements, feed down to regional and local, and also probably to the practical level for consultants to take actions to make that new, to fulfill that new requirements. So things seems happening every day. I mean, looking at the new guidance, new things come up. As of last weekend, as we know, the Earthshot Prize has been awarded. I think the key concept of that is really to looking for a solution. We have enough problem. We know we have a lot of problem, but let's not just focus our attention to the problems we are facing. Let's looking for solutions. That's a key message. Something in the air? Indeed. As of this morning, LETI launched their new retrofit guidance as well. As of last weekend, from Saturday and ongoing, I know at King's Cross, if you're passing there, there are 5 air pollution pods on display. So each pod actually simulate the pollution you can feel. You can walk in to feel the air from Norway, which is very clean, London, Beijing, New Delhi, and Sao Paulo. Some people experience that when they walked into New Delhi port. You can't imagine you probably can live in that kind of polluted air for very long. So the idea of that is actually to generating discussion, make people realize action is really needed for now. So if you're passing King's Cross, I suggest you probably go to experience that. So the changes are happening. I hope all those changes are a real positive change. Thank you. I probably will end my my talk here. I think now it's time really to open to the floor to questions, to hear what you think, to hear your insight, and to, I think also to seek opportunities to collaborate, because no one can do things alone. Any questions? Howard will master the question session.
Well, yes. I mean, if there's no questions at the moment, then I guess I'll start you off with one. So, okay, with my developer hat on, air quality positive, new London plan requirement. What exact measures? What particular measures are there? For instance, that developments could introduce. Will they actually have an active effect to reduce air pollution? And will it actually cost me as a developer more or constrain my scheme at all anymore?
Howard, we can see the couple of questions come along in the chat box, as well as Paul has raised his hands. Probably you will take that question later. I will briefly answer, probably providing some idea, some thoughts about the air quality positive. So air quality positive by no means can providing all the answers. However, that's actually, I think the whole mindset, the concept is actually bring the air pollution issue consideration at early stage of the scheme. Try to work with architects, designers, working with energy consultants, transport consultants, to looking for an optimized solution. Because I think if we're working in the air quality sector, we all know most of air quality assessment is done as almost after design frozen. So by then it's too late. If you want to change anything, it's all been fixed. So the whole point of air quality positive is bring that thinking, bring that mindset much earlier in the stage of any development, even in the conceptual design stage. So I think that's the main thing. If we're looking at cost, depending how you view it, if you're looking at the overall benefit would create, if you actually achieve air quality positive outcome, the benefit of health, the benefit of the residents, the benefit of the reduction to the NHS admission and so on, is far greater than probably a short-term cost putting up front. Also, it's actually adding value to developer if they can demonstrate they have a long-lasting, healthy, ecologically viable, as well as climate resilient, low carbon. If we not say zero carbon, I know that's quite tall order to achieve. It's actually adding value to developers' asset. If we're looking that way, if we're not looking at in 5 years, we're looking at 30 years down the line. Can we imagining a zero carbon world in 2050? We're still around. So I would say this is a really positive signal in terms of air quality positive statement being brought in to the New London plan.
Brilliant.
Paul may have a question, I think. Would you like to unmute, Paul?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, everyone. Paul Devitt from Capita GL Hearn, ex-colleague of Sean's. Got a couple of questions, and thanks very much for that presentation, really informative. As an architect, working with a local authority here in Cardiff, we're working on, as Sean knows, we're working on some major strategic schemes, master planning stage and so on large development sites on regeneration land in Cardiff Bay. So two questions really. One is at a macro level in terms of the resilience of the UK, given our dependency on wind for electricity generation, with a view to supplying all the energy to all these heat pumps that are coming down the line. And the issue that arose, I think it was in August, when we had an abnormal degree of high pressure and very little wind to keep those turbines moving, which I think accelerated the energy issue that we're currently experiencing. And the second question I've got is around local authorities that have signed up to being net zero carbon by 2030. Given the cultural assets that we have, that a lot of these local authorities have, what are your views on the resilience in respect of funding their retrofit objectives?
Okay, interesting questions. Well, I'll jump in with my take on it. So yes, I mean, we are probably over-reliant on wind at the moment, and as you pointed out, it only takes a period of calm and a storm brews in the sort of energy mix. I think that's part of the government's thinking in terms of introducing things like the hydrogen strategy and investing quite heavily in the smart grid side of it, so that it provides you the flexibility, provides more of the storage capabilities, so that when your renewables aren't performing so well, then you can tap into things that you might have otherwise stored. And hydrogen production is linked to producing a surplus of wind energy at the moment. I think that's the way they're trying to model the approach on that. In terms of the one about local authorities, how they hit their own 2030 targets, I mean, it's a great test case, I think, because local authorities should have knowledge and control of their own assets. I know in London there's a rather large and ever swelling carbon offset fund or set of funds that local authorities can take from developers to offset any remaining carbon. That I think is yet to take off around the UK, but there's also public sector decarbonisation funds and other government grants and investment available for local authorities and other public sector bodies to kind of identify and retrofit their own buildings, their fleets and things like that. I think you mentioned about cultural or cultural heritage. I'm not sure if you're referring to the cultural heritage side of it, but there are, I think, Historic England has produced some particular informative guidance about how you can retrofit heritage assets to be quite sensitive to the existing fabric of those buildings. And so, you know, all of those things hopefully, you know, will play a part in resolving that. But of course, we're still quite early days in. We're only like 2 years down the path of the climate emergency. Obviously, we should be a bit further by now, but.
Okay, thanks, Harold. Yeah, cheers.
Okay. Right. Thank you from Chris Beret. What about equity issues, given that those who experience the most adverse impacts are likely to cause, least likely to cause the problem, especially in relation to flying? Is this likely to be a policy driver? I mean, yeah, couldn't agree with you more. The levelling up side of it. I was thinking about what the government's net zero strategy that was released last week or this week could go further on, and it's actually putting their money where their mouth is a little bit more on the levelling up, because a lot of the measures within there, such as providing a £5,000 fund for homeowners towards a heat pump, for instance, does discriminate against poorer households because they might not have the remaining amount. So I would like to see that there's actually a full grant available for that. And again, the move towards electric vehicles is a real fundamental one, in that 65% of poorer households don't actually own a car. So if you're replacing all of those cars with electric cars, you're going to get an ever decreasing amount of people with access and who don't feel left behind, without the government actually investing more in the public transport and hydrogen buses and that sort of thing. Okay, right. So here's final question, perhaps from Nigel. It's 5 minutes. From Nigel to Sean and Matt, actually. What are your top 3 tips for reducing your personal carbon footprint? Probably goes back a little bit to your daughter, Sean. What would you do?
I think children do have a solution, right? I'm looking for the hope in the next generation, really. I would first of all do, I think I will slash all the Christmas wishes. Don't buy anything you don't need. They probably will be upset. Seriously though, reducing our personal carbon footprint, I would think probably really to looking for reducing the demand side of things. Can we ask ourselves, do we really need that many staff? I mean, do we really need that much of fast fashion, or do we really need all those material kind of things in our life? I know it's not easy, because the human nature sometimes direct us to want more things. But I would think reducing the personal carbon footprint, one of the first steps is to reducing demand. Secondly, I would say probably looking at how we would be able to reducing energy consumption in our own household, in our own environment. Try to be mindful. For example, we very often left the lights on when we left home, which seems kind of taken for granted. What difference that can make? In fact, I did an experiment many years ago. I was writing a blog about our personal carbon footprinting. So I tried to switch off all our electric devices at home in the night, which sometimes actually we're too lazy. Okay, we didn't do that because the TV monitor was left on standby. All the laptop monitors, computer monitors being left on standby. Printer, home printer being left on standby, will never switch off. But if we just take that extra step, try to remember to switch off all the devices in the night, it's made a huge difference. We had a 25% reduction on the energy bill. So we're trying to do that. I think that's something we can do if we're really mindful. Thirdly, I probably would say is reducing food waste. I think that's achievable in terms of personal level. Food waste is also a huge issue. We sometimes taking things for granted for what we have. We thought, because those things in the development country come too easy in a way. So I was actually try to learn a little bit more from children, because recently they have done looking at harvest, looking at things. So I was often being told off by them if I did something silly. So that's a good discipline at home, I suppose. So, but reducing food waste, I feel is also important.
Okay. Brilliant. Well, we've got one more minute to go. One more question. Thanks, Neil. Do you think COVID-19 recovery poses a risk to reaching net zero or climate change adaptation? For example, increased preference for people to drive, the travel bounce, so people are all taking the opportunity to fly abroad, lack of government money for green investment, or do you think the COVID green recovery will genuinely be aligned? Okay, I mean, I will answer in a very brief way. I think that rather than a risk to reaching net zero, I think that actually it provides an opportunity. And what it certainly has done is shown that things can happen very quickly if we all put our heads together and we get clear direction from governance. And and sort of the green recovery, COVID green recovery is essentially that's one area that I think is lacking a little bit in terms of the amount of investment in green jobs, in terms of the upskilling of people to be able to retrofit a vast number of homes, install heat pumps and all of that sort of thing. So there's definitely a risk, but there's also a huge opportunity. Okay, well, I think that brings us to 2 o'clock, and I would like to thank everyone for calling in today, and my co-presenters Shana and Matthew. Our emails are on the screen that you should hopefully see, and please do drop us a line about anything. We do indeed feel that the time is right for collaboration and working together to try and track this, and really do feel that there is something in the air that feels quite good.
Thank you, Howard. Thank you, Matt. Do you have a golden sentence as a last summary?
Okay, my golden sentence is, change is a fact of life. So make sure you take the chance to make a positive change, no matter how small they seem.
Good.
Mine would be much shorter. Improving air quality needn't be difficult. We can do it.
Thank you. You give me a huge challenge to come up with my golden line. I probably would say collaborate. Let's seek solutions, not problems. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.